Hello, I'm Paul Sparrow, the director of the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and welcome to another session of At Home with the Roosevelts. Today we're going to be talking about two political giants and the unusual relationship they had, Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And joining us for this conversation is the director of the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library and Museum, Mark Lawrence. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be with you to talk about what has to be the most interesting relationship between two 20th century presidents.
When you think about the periods in which they were president, you wouldn't think they would have much in common. FDR in the 30s and early 40s, and LBJ obviously in the mid-60s. And yet, of course, their relationship goes back to the very beginning of Lyndon Johnson's political career. And we'll start, I'll give you a little bit of opportunity to set up the background of when Johnson first came to Washington as essentially a congressional aide.
So exactly, LBJ had been working as a teacher, and one day in 1931 gets a call telling him that a job opening is available to him to go and be the secretary for a guy named Richard Cleburne, who was had just won a seat, a special election for a House seat from Texas. And LBJ by this point was well known as a very skilled political figure, and he took this position, jumped at it, and went off to Washington. And first, it's important to recognize as a staff member to another to a member of the House, and he was wildly successful at this and really thrived in that early New Deal period when Washington was booming in unprecedented ways.
And many of the sort of East Coast New Deal liberals were somewhat so we say put off by this young, lanky Texan and his big ideas, but they were almost immediately impressed with his political skills and his abilities. In fact, he helped draft some of the language that was used to create the National Youth Administration while he was a staffer. You talk about that a little bit and then what that directly led to.
Well, I think going back to the first thing that you said, you're absolutely right. The New Deal was closely associated with a kind of East Coast elite, and no one more so than FDR himself, this sort of aristocratic figure, Harvard, Columbia Law School, forms this sort of unlikely partnership with the product of the Southwest Texas State Teachers College, who hailed from tiny Johnson City, Texas. And LBJ was an outsider to that world, but he was immediately recognized, I think, by FDR and certainly others around him as an unusually skilled political mind. FDR called him a political genius. And you're quite right in suggesting that his skills were put to use right from the get-go in, among other things, helping to draft the legislation for an organization that he would run in Texas, the National Youth Administration.
And actually, FDR, once the legislation got passed for the National Youth Administration, which was sort of part of the Works Project Administration, FDR selected Lyndon Johnson to go back to Texas to run this operation, which was essentially a way to give money to young people, teenagers and college kids, to either allow them to get into college or to finish college or to get job training in that period so that they wouldn't have their careers essentially destroyed by the Depression. And Johnson used that authority and the ability to give that money very, very effectively and began to build his own political base.
He did. I think that's exactly right. He was very skilled, as throughout his career, in using resources to build loyalty, to cultivate connections, to build a network that would be very valuable to him. And I think on a deeper level, too, he learned in that period how to use the instruments of government to bring real benefits and reform to ordinary people back home in Texas who were really struggling, of course, in the conditions of the Great Depression. So it was a formative experience for him in terms of becoming the political operator he would become, but also I think in sort of solidifying his liberal outlook. And by liberal, I mean that sense that the government can be used to bring real reform, not 100 years down the road, but really in people's lives.
So it's 1935 and LBJ's in Texas, and he gives away, I think, something like 30,000 young men and women. Women were included in this, unlike the Civilian Conservation Corps. I guess 30,000 people benefit from his thing. And then an opportunity comes along when a Texas congressman, I'm not sure if he passes away, Buchanan, or retires, but Johnson can now run for this seat. And in running for the seat, it's him against 9 other candidates. It's a sudden death election. And FDR is so impressed with LBJ that he actually goes down and campaigns for him.
That's right. FDR clearly recognized political talent, and also someone who could help him, FDR, reach into a part of the country where culturally, if not politically, the connections were a little more tenuous. So I think it's very revealing that the love affair was not just in LBJ's direction toward FDR, but very much in the other direction as well.
And it says a lot about LBJ's sort of political mindset, in that of the 10 candidates who were running, he was the only one who ran supporting FDR's attempt to restack the Supreme Court, which is a highly controversial topic, very unpopular. All the other 9 candidates all opposed it, and Johnson essentially said, okay, well, this is what's going to differentiate me. I'm going to run on this, which of course endeared him to FDR, but also allowed him to win the election when he really had no right. He was running, every other candidate that he was running against had more experience and better name recognition.
Court issue is so fascinating. I think LBJ had such shrewd political instincts. He understood what the other candidates did not. This could potentially be a winner for him, and would certainly help him to stand out. Turned out, of course, to be a terrific move on LBJ's part.
Now, when LBJ wins the election, shows up in Washington, it's the late 30s, the sort of the New Deal in its peak form before the war years have really started, and in addition to Franklin Roosevelt, LBJ had another very, very powerful mentor in Sam Rayburn. And this was one of those relationships that lasted really until the 1960s when Rayburn died. Talk a little bit about that troika, FDR, Rayburn, Johnson.
It seems to me one of the reasons why FDR had such interest in LBJ's career, as I mentioned before, is that LBJ gave FDR and perhaps the New Deal more generally a kind of point of entry into a part of the country where the New Deal wasn't a sure thing politically. And one of the things that FDR really liked was that LBJ gave him a conduit to Sam Rayburn, to his own vice president, John Nance Garner, a Texan. In short, LBJ was a kind of bridge into this world that was very important to FDR and his prospects for getting his agenda passed. And absolutely, LBJ goes on to form a very close partnership, really friendship, with Sam Rayburn. Rayburn, as the story goes, was a bachelor who saw in LBJ this young and ambitious and very likable in many ways figure, and they formed a very close bond that, as you say, would go on, would last for a very long time. Very similar to the relationship that LBJ develops with the Georgia Senator Richard Russell, also a bachelor who becomes very close to LBJ's family, sort of is welcomed into the family fold in a very personal way.
One of the things that I was most interested in when I first started learning about their relationship, I assumed that LBJ made more of it as time went on after FDR died than there really was there, as many people do if they had a brief encounter with a very, very famous person. But in this case, there really was a very personal relationship there. And one of the stories that really surprised me, as a freshman congressmen are rarely given significant appointments to powerful committees. But FDR calls Congressman Vinson in to the White House, and they have a nice little dinner. And Vinson is thinking, okay, what does FDR want? Why has he called me here for this? And at the end of the dinner, FDR tells Vinson, I'd like you to take a look at this young congressman from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, and put him on the Naval Affairs Committee, which in the lead up to World War II became, extremely important committee, very, very powerful, unusual to put a freshman in that position. And of course, Vinson went back and he did it. And Johnson finds himself on this very powerful committee. And I think that shows right from the very beginning that that FDR saw Johnson not only as an up-and-coming star, but as an ally.
you knew you were getting somewhere with FDR when he gave you some piece of control over the Navy, right? That institution that he cherished above all others. And exactly as you say, it's very revealing that this youngster gets that appointment so early on. And during the Second World War, after LBJ comes back from his brief military experience in the Pacific, he actually is appointed chair of one of the subcommittees of that Naval Committee that really gave him a very significant amount of control over important decisions having to do with allocations of resources into the defense industry. The task was partly to stay on top of the efficiency with which supplies and military gear and manpower was being used. It was the House equivalent in many ways of what Harry Truman was doing in the Senate. Very, very powerful position.
FDR, because of his polio and his paralysis, had a very, very protected personal space. And there are only very few people who are really allowed into, his personal space when he's not performing. And Johnson was one of those people. FDR used to invite Lyndon Johnson to his home, to the residency at the White House in the morning, and he would have breakfast with him while FDR was still in bed in his pajamas, and they would talk about things. He would invite him over for dinner. The Roosevelt's aide and later good friend of Johnson's, James H. Rowe, said, quote, "You've got to remember that these two great political geniuses, and that FDR could talk to LBJ on a level in which he could talk to few men," which I find very interesting. And then Lady Bird Johnson later said that every time her husband came back from the White House, he was on a sort of high. And you realize that this relationship really was not necessarily between peers, but there was a sense that FDR was dealing with an equal who had a potential, as FDR himself said, to become the first Southern president in 100 years.
That's right. You're quite right. It was Rowe and not FDR himself who called LBJ a political genius. I apologize. I think I got that wrong. But absolutely, there was something, it seems to me, instrumental about their relationship. They understood that each man could advance the political interests that were very near and dear to each of them. But as I think you're suggesting, there was much more to it than that. And a quote that I find really revealing. This is FDR speaking to Harold Ickes. He says of LBJ, he was the kind of uninhibited young pro that he, FDR, would like to have been as a young man. So there was almost this recognition, I think, on FDR's part that this pretty brash, young, incredibly energetic man was someone that perhaps FDR wishes he could have been more like in earlier phases of his own career.
Now, once the war starts, as you mentioned, Lyndon Johnson, joins the Navy. He has some missions. FDR sends him to the Pacific to try to figure out what's going on out there. And Johnson comes back with a fairly critical look at some of the things that the Navy is doing, which, of course, was always, you took great risk in criticizing the Navy to FDR, but Johnson was able to do that, and he came back with some very important recommendations. You want to talk about those a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So the war is not going particularly well in the Southwest Pacific. In late 1941, early 1942, FDR becomes aware of this, and he really needs someone he really trusts to send off to this military theater to figure out what's going on. So it's revealing of a lot of the things we've been talking about that LBJ gets chosen along with two others for that task. So LBJ goes off to the Southwest Pacific. He's met immediately by none other than Douglas MacArthur, and he spends some time studying what's going on and essentially what's going wrong with the war effort in this very early phase of combat during the Second World War. And yes, LBJ comes back with a whole set of critiques having to do with how shortages, in his view, of manpower in that part of the world, insufficient equipment. Basically, I think one of the critiques was clearly that the other parts of the war, other fronts in the war in the Pacific were getting more resources, better equipment, and so forth, and this part of the fight needed that same degree of attention. So, as you say, it was a very scathingly critical assessment.
And when Johnson comes back to Washington, of course, as you get towards the end of the war and President Roosevelt's health is failing, the Democrats start to lose some of their vast majorities. They had supermajorities in both houses for many years, Senate and House, and the Republicans start making inroads. And then after FDR's death in 1945, of course, Harry Truman becomes president, and LBJ and Truman had a very different kind of relationship.
A much more distant relationship, it seems to me. And I think part of it, too, is that the political environment was changing by that point. And LBJ was a very shrewd politician in a lot of ways. But one of the ways in which I think he was shrewd is that he was a bit of a political chameleon. He could change his stripes depending on what the prevailing mood of the moment was. And as the American public became a little more conservative, a little more skeptical of that New Deal spirit that had ridden so high in the mid and late 1930s, LBJ tacked in that direction as well. And of course, this was very shrewd move on his part. He took positions on labor and other issues that were in some ways at odds with the positions he had taken back during the 1930s. And some of these positions put him at odds with the Truman administration. And
now, of course, after President Roosevelt dies, the relationship shifts to one between Eleanor Roosevelt and LBJ. We have some very interesting letters and correspondence between the two of them, particularly regarding the Civil Rights Act. So LBJ eventually shifts from the Congress to the Senate, becomes a very, very powerful force within the Senate. In 1957, he gets this Civil Rights Act passed, which Eleanor Roosevelt was very disappointed in. She felt it didn't go anywhere near far enough. Talk a little bit about the reality of what Johnson was able to accomplish in 57, particularly around the Civil Rights Act, and the complexities of their relationships, because at that point they'd known each other for, more than 25 years.
Indeed, and there's wonderful photos of LBJ and John F. Kennedy and Eleanor Roosevelt, and but you're quite right. One of the moments that's most revealing, I think, in their relationship comes around the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And these letters, by the way, I brushed up in preparation for our conversation today, are easily accessible online. So anyone who's interested can find them with a very small amount of effort. But I think they reveal Eleanor Roosevelt showing great respect for LBJ, acknowledging his political skills, acknowledging his persuasive powers, but also taking him to task for the fact that the 57 Civil Rights Act did not go as far as Eleanor Roosevelt and many other liberals would have liked. And in reply, you see LBJ pushing back and saying, look, it's not exactly as you think, and there's a lot of kind of nitpicking, I think it's fair to say, over some of the technicalities of the bill. But you don't have to read too far between the lines to see that LBJ is really saying, look, this is what is politically possible at this moment. And Eleanor Roosevelt, to be fair, I think recognizes that in her letters as well, and says, in fact, this is better than no bill at all. But she is ultimately somewhat disappointed, I think, in LBJ and his leadership on that bill in a way that would at least initially affect her attitude toward the Kennedy-Johnson ticket in 1960.
What's very interesting is her language and her argument to LBJ is very similar to the argument she used to make to FDR when he was president, particularly around the federal anti-lynching laws that she fought so hard for that FDR wouldn't support, and some of the other legislation that she felt didn't go far enough. And it's almost like she just picked up, the role of conscience that she played within the Roosevelt administration and shifted it over, focusing it on Johnson, because at that point, especially during the Eisenhower years, he was the most powerful Democrat in Washington. And then when he and Kennedy run the ticket, Eleanor had been a big supporter of Adlai Stevenson. And so there was some real tension there between the two camps. When Kennedy won the nomination and Johnson comes on the ticket, she was very concerned that Johnson was going to shift Kennedy even more away from civil rights. And they had a conversation about that. And there's a wonderful photograph of them at the convention, where you see her talking to him and she's got a smile on her face, but she's lecturing him on something.
No. It's so interesting, I think, to think ourselves back into that period before JFK and LBJ get elected, and to think about what the perception was of these two figures. And both of them, for somewhat different reasons, were not the top choice of Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson and other liberals, right, who saw them as, in different ways, embodiments of the more conservative tendencies within the Democratic Party. JFK had failed in the minds of many liberals to distance himself sufficiently from Joe McCarthy, had taken moderate, if not downright conservative positions on a number of issues, including civil rights. LBJ, the Dixiecrat, the Southerner, was a suspicious character simply by virtue of being from Texas, and of course some of the votes that he had cast across his career as well. So it took some doing, I think, for Eleanor Roosevelt to move on and to ultimately become outwardly, avowedly supportive of JFK. But those doubts really lingered for a long time.
So after Kennedy becomes president and Johnson becomes vice president, Kennedy tries to bring Eleanor into the administration, appointing her as the Commission on the Status of Women, which of course was something that Eleanor had fought her whole life for. But her health starts to fade, and she dies in 1962. And Lyndon Johnson and JFK both come to Hyde Park for her funeral. And I think there was a real sense of loss for Johnson in Eleanor's passing, because he felt so connected to the New Deal and to his political beginnings and how the Roosevelts had helped him. And talk a little bit about that, and then the transition as Johnson is elevated to presidency.
Paul, it sounds like you have an idea about a specific piece of evidence that might shed light on LBJ's attitude toward Eleanor's passing. I can only say that surely this must have come as a blow to him, given the debt in some ways that he owed to the Roosevelts for his own political career and the outlook on American life that they shared in such a profound way back during the 1930s. It seems to me that one of the best places to look for that enduring connection is actually in Lady Bird, who speaks very glowingly of Eleanor many years after Eleanor Roosevelt's passing in 1962.
One of the pictures that we have up here that I'm always amused by is that when he was president, LBJ visited the FDR library here in Hyde Park, and he landed a helicopter in the front yard. We have a picture of him in this helicopter in what we call the Great Lawn in front of the library, because he wanted to come and visit the library. And I think he was probably thinking about what his own presidential library would be. But I do think there is a direct connection to be made between FDR's New Deal policies and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And I think, Lyndon Johnson saw himself, perhaps more than any other American politician, as the advocate, as the acolyte for the fulfillment of FDR's dreams. Talk a little bit about the relationship between his Great Society legislation and the New Deal.
Absolutely. And by the way, that sounds so LBJ to show up in a helicopter landing on the front lawn in a way that no one could possibly miss. But I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that's really remarkable about LBJ's political career is that he speaks so openly about finishing someone else's political agenda. Now, LBJ, of course, was capturing plenty of headlines and put his own spin, his own stamp on all of this. But he spoke repeatedly, consistently across his political career about his desire to complete the New Deal, right? To pick up the agenda that FDR had pioneered and bring it to some sense of completion. That said, there are some really interesting differences between the New Deal and the Great Society as these broad-based agendas for reform. I mean, the most obvious is probably that, look, the New Deal comes about under conditions of great national crisis. It's designed to fix immediate problems, put people back to work, put food on their plates, whereas the Great Society comes about in a period of enormous American prosperity. It's really about reapportioning the benefits of the huge prosperity that was lifting all boats in some ways in the United States, but some much faster than others. So there was a sense of creating justice, of dividing the pie more evenly, if you like, that's quite different from what FDR and the New Dealers had in mind in an earlier period. Of course, another way to think about the differences between the two movements as well is that the New Deal largely was focused on white, industrial, urban workers. It's not totally true, but largely that's where the focus lay. It was designed to help people who had been in relatively advantageous positions in the economy until the Great Catastrophe struck. Whereas the Great Society, of course, was about helping the really marginal people in American society, people who weren't sharing in the general prosperity. So the poor, minorities, very much including African Americans, Latinos from his own part of the country, and so forth. So it was very much about finding the people who had sort of been left behind, as all of those other folks, did very well in many cases amid the booming economy of the 1950s and 60s.
I think one of the great accomplishments of the Johnson administration was the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65, things that FDR really had not been able to accomplish. I think Eleanor, had she lived, would have been very pleased with the 64 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in a way that she wasn't in the 1957 Act. But there's such a Shakespearean quality to Johnson, in contrast to FDR, and that FDR's legacy really is partially cemented on his role as commander-in-chief and the success of the Allied forces during World War II. And of course, Johnson, right at the peak of his Great Society and everything he wanted to do to try to transform America, is sidelined by the Vietnam War. And I have to say that if you look at the people that FDR put around him for his military advisors and the people that Johnson had around him for his military advisors, Johnson's advisors do not hold up well.
I think you're right about that. And I think that one of the problems with the advice that LBJ was receiving in 1963, 1964, 1965 about Vietnam is that it was so anchored in overconfidence. American military commanders and civilian foreign policy experts, for that matter, by 1963, 1964, really believed, I think, at some level that there was no problem that was too big for the United States. Look, we had done it during the Second World War. We'd sent millions and millions of Americans off to fight on multiple fronts and marshaled incredible amounts of resources. Surely there was no problem, particularly in a small country like Vietnam, that could defeat us. So he was victimized in some ways by some of the same currents of thinking that encouraged him to be bold in the domestic arena. Both Vietnam and the Great Society, I like to say, emerged from the same sense of abundant resources and an American solution for every problem.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote a wonderful book on leadership, as well as books on LBJ and Roosevelt and Teddy and others, she talks about their two very different leadership styles. LBJ was very confrontational. The LBJ treatment, he'd get right up in somebody's face and lean in and use his physical presence as a means of intimidation, and believed in the strong arm approach. Whereas Roosevelt was much more diplomatic and suave, and it was always charming people and often telling people whatever they wanted to hear and then going and doing exactly what he wanted. Whereas Johnson was very clear, this is what I want you to do. I know you don't want to do it, but you're going to do it anyway, so if you don't, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
and so politically.
Exactly.
And so that there's such a difference in their political styles. And yet, as a historian who studied, four of the greatest presidents in our history, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and LBJ, she considers him the most effective in terms of legislation. And in many ways, I think that's Johnson's great legacy, is his effectiveness in getting legislation passed.
I think that's right. And in that respect, I suppose most historians would rank him second behind FDR in his ability to advance his legislative agenda. Much of it coming, of course, like FDR, in that early period after he comes into office. But as you say, the Vietnam War intrudes in some ways on LBJ's greatest dreams. It seems to me there's an argument probably to be made as well that American public opinion was changing in ways that were somewhat independent of the war that might well have given LBJ greater trouble later in his presidency, even absent the Vietnam War. LBJ seemed to acknowledge that. He says early in his time in office that honeymoons don't last long, so let's get busy. Whereas FDR, I hate to put it this way, but in some roundabout sense, sort of had the benefit of ongoing crisis that helped him make a plausible case for more initiatives, for more activism over a longer period of time.
Well, we could talk about these two guys forever. I find them endlessly interesting. And of course, the Johnson Presidential Library Museum down there in Austin is a magnificent Taj Mahal. It's certainly one of the grandest of the presidential libraries. And Johnson was very proud of it, particularly that wall of archives that when you first came into the great room. And, I think he really appreciated his role in history. He appreciated historical record. And I think of all of the presidential libraries, one of the most extraordinary assets that any of us have are the tapes that LBJ made, that he basically said, let it all out. Warts and all, I don't care. People can see how I ran the presidency, and it's an extraordinary collection of recordings that have been transcribed now. And I guess they're still releasing them, but what do you think about those? What are you going to do with them?
Well, as you say, they're mostly out. There's a few more that may trickle out over the coming years, but fortunately, we've had great success in getting them out over a number of years. It's been a big project. But I think you're right. They are inescapably, I think, the kind of crown jewel of our archival holdings here at the LBJ Library. They're widely available online, so easy to find and make for, I think, endlessly interesting listening. And, I think all presidents are probably this way to some degree, but I think LBJ may be an extreme case. For many years, you as a researcher would go to the LBJ Library and, there's a mountain of material, 45 million pages, but it's very hard to find LBJ. Occasionally you'd get a check mark, maybe some initials, but he didn't write things down. He wasn't a big reader. He wasn't a big writer. Right? He's not much present in that textual material. So when we started to get these recordings, you could suddenly see what was going on in a much clearer way than ever before inside LBJ's head. You could appreciate his style as well, the tone he used. You could really understand, I think, in a visceral way for the first time what it was like to be on the receiving end of the Johnson treatment. So needless to say, it's been an invaluable addition for anyone hoping to understand Johnson.
And I can highly recommend people going online. You can see it at the library, and there's documentaries and YouTube videos that feature those recordings. They're quite remarkable. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Keep up the great work out there.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Same to you. Appreciate it very much.
And that's the end of another session for At Home with the Roosevelts. We hope you'll join us again soon.